all of you so much for joining us for We Keep Us Safe, a virtual town hall on police brutality and state violence. Over the next 90 minutes, I will be joined by some of the country's leading organizers and activists on the front lines of the movement to defund the police. We will also hear from the family members of Marley Graham, Botham J, Sean Monterosa, and Delron Small, along with advocates who work closely with them. And we are honored to be able to introduce to you Jacob Servin, a young Latino man from Stockton, California, and Akbar Rogers, a Black man from Long Island, New York, both of whom are recent survivors of police brutality. Since the murder of George Floyd on Memorial Day, it seems that the nation has finally started to catch up to the realities of police brutality and state violence against people of color. And I'm here to say to all of you, welcome to the movement. We need you. First up tonight, we thought it would be important to give you all a brief history of policing in America. To join me in this conversation is somebody who I love very deeply. And I'm happy to welcome Bria Baker, a member of Justice League NYC and the racial justice organization Inspired Justice. Bria is joining us from Atlanta. Hey, Bria.
Hey, Carm. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it always feels full circle being able to facilitate with you because Justice League and the Gathering for Justice was the political home that gave me so many of the tools to allow me to even know some of the things to share. So just thank you for your leadership and your cultivation. And I'm so excited to be doing this brief history of policing, emphasis on the brief, which is to say that we could talk about this for hours and hours and probably days, really, if we're being honest. But I just want to talk about an overview of what reform has looked like, because we've been trying to reform American policing for the last several centuries. And so we're going to just look at what policing, even in the construction of policing, how it began. And recognizing the systems of oppression it's built on. So first and foremost, we talk about policing like it's been something we've had since the beginning of time. But especially in the US, we hadn't had policing obviously since colonialism. And in the 16th century, 17th century, even like 18th century, policing was just night watches. And it was really informal vigilante style, which gives way to the George Zimmermans, right? But just this idea that community members would volunteer to keep the community safe. And that community policing transitioned into a more formal version of policing around the 1800s, which is also around the time that the institution of slavery was beginning to crumble. And from the very beginning, this institution of policing was really rooted on protecting white people's capital. And at that time, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, we were all considered a part of that capital or a hindrance to that capital. And so we became the thing that needed to be policed as well. But the first police were slave patrollers. And that was like in the 1700s. And the slave patrollers were to chase down fugitive enslaved people, but also to enforce law on plantations. So we don't really talk about that either, but the idea of overseers outsourcing the protection and the policing of the labor source to policemen and to the slave patrollers. And then after the Civil War, this just became even more fortified. And this idea that for us to be able to control and protect American capitalism and where the US was going as an industrial leader, there was this huge emphasis on vigilante style organizations, police being one of those, the KKK and the White Citizens Council being other versions of that, to really enforce Jim Crow segregation. And I think another thing that's important for us to remember about the Civil War was even when we had, the slave patrollers, policing then was not rooted around the idea of crime as we know it. Crime was sort of created. It's a social construct very similar to race and gender, in that crime was created to give an excuse to incarcerate. And the idea that the US would not be where it is today without unpaid labor, and what was the US going to do when they were forced to pay people. And this loophole, which those of you who've watched Ava DuVernay's 13th on Netflix know, the loophole of the 13th Amendment was, if we can get people to believe that these people are monsters and criminals, and we criminalize all of the different things that we do, now we have a built-in labor force. And so after the Civil War is the first time things like trespassing and vagrancy, walking on certain sides of the sidewalk, disobeying Jim Crow rules became a form of crime. And the bigger that need was, the more expansive that view of crime became. And so this carceral state just grew and grew and grew. And the whole time that this is growing, and is being used to oppress Black people and continue to keep us subjugated, we're also seeing police expanding into the union busting. And this idea that, wait, if police are here to protect capital, then police can protect our property, police can protect us from our workers, police can protect us from this movement that is saying we deserve more than being exploited. And so all of this is a form of social control. And it just continues to snowball and snowball into something deeper. So in the 60s and 70s, we see this criminalization of hippie culture and the sexually liberated folks of that time, but also of activists, followed by COINTELPRO and the FBI's intention to subvert Black and brown and red-led social justice movements by defining them as terrorists, which, I mean, we're seeing all of these things happen right now across the country, in Portland, Detroit, Chicago, New York City, with Black activists being labeled as extremists. And so this social control is really important because, again, it all ties back to how can we use this social control to profit us? You know, obviously there are some people who are out there that are just malicious, but the average person is not investing this much time in building this elaborate system of mass incarceration for nothing, but for there to be a way to profit off of it. And so what was originally the carceral state, which right after the Civil War in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was, you know, coal miners and people who were incarcerated being rented out to industries like that, then became, okay, wait, we can rent these laborers out to private corporations. We can have incarcerated people making your bras and your computers and make that so built into the fabric that we convince people it's a part of their rehabilitation. And so I've been, you know, I've been spitting a lot to y'all, but it's important that we remember the roots of this so that we are vigilant of the ways that detention is being repositioned to us and repackaged to us. So now criminal justice is sexy. We all want to talk about bail reform, but we're seeing that our Black and brown sisters and brothers and siblings who are undocumented and are coming from all parts of the world, including but not limited to Latin America, we're seeing that as a new form of detainment. We're seeing this, okay, if criminal justice is not appropriate anymore and is not cool, let's just expand criminality to include those who are traveling for a better life. And many of us, including people of color, have become a part of the cog that says, okay, well, I'm down to not be the one who's mass incarcerated as long as there's someone else that is that brunt force. And so we just have to remember that all of our liberation is bound in one another's, that the same systems of oppression that are being weaponized against us are being weaponized against other communities. The same systems that said we can exploit free labor at the expense of Black people is doing that same thing to brown people from Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, et cetera. And so we need to know those linkages, because when we know better, we do better.
Thank you so much for that, Bria. I know that you and I talk a lot about this, kind of the parallels between Black and brown people, right? And so we've also talked a lot, especially some of the teachings from my father, who was a 94-year-old man who was born in California in 1924, and his family being here. And so I want to also provide some history of some of the lynching that happened in the Mexican community. And so although the lynching of African Americans in the Deep South is heavily documented, few people know about the history of a similar kind of lawless violence against Mexicans in the West. Some of the victims have been lynched, burned alive, whipped, or shot. just for being of Mexican heritage. And many of the victims were actually US citizens. These were my father's ancestors. And some of the acts of violence even drew crowds of spectators in thousands. Historians have cataloged 597 lynchings of persons of Mexican origin or descent in the United States and stress that this is a conservative estimate. The locations of most of these cases were in Texas, about 282, in California, about 188. Actually, I went to UC Santa Cruz and there were people of Mexican descent that were lynched in Santa Cruz, Arizona, 59, and New Mexico, 49. Breaking down the incidents, researchers have found that the 31-year period between 1848 and 1879 had an astonishing lynching rate of 473 per 100,000 people. In 1918, a group of Texas Rangers, US Army cavalry soldiers, and cattle ranchers raided a Texas town, killing all the men and boys and burning the village to the ground. Often these acts of racial terror have been portrayed as valiant white settlers saving the land from savages and foreigners. Even today, efforts to remember this history has been politically contested to protect the white supremacist version of history in southwestern states. When you consider the fact that many of our families were indigenous to this land before it was the US or Mexico, we often say the border didn't cross us, or we didn't cross the border crossed us. And you view these acts of mob violence side by side with things like forced boarding schools to separate indigenous children from their families, and the forced deportations of US citizens of Mexican heritage. That was something that happened to my father's family in 1930 under the Repatriation Act. What we see is a state of violence that is chilling. Latinos as well often get pitted against our Black siblings in very visceral ways. In prisons, we see that a lot with race riots in the community, in politics, and subsequently, we don't always see our issues facing the Black community as our own. The truth is that we have more in common, and this shared history is a big part of why we bear the burden of struggles with police brutality and lawless killings. According to the Washington Post, there's more than 5,000 fatal police shootings since 2015 that have impacted Latinos. Latinos are the second largest demographic killed by police. Just last month, and we will hear from one of the family members, we will hear from family members from one of the 3 unarmed men, Latino men that were killed by police in California. Within 2 weeks, we will be hearing, also, when we also think about and look at the killings at the hands of ICE agents and the systemic blind eye turn to killings at the border, the numbers would even be greater. So while raising awareness about the history of Latinos and how we have also been impacted by not only incarceration, but also lynchings and police brutality, it's also important for us to continue to organize and center Black lives. Cesar Chavez has said, preservation of one culture means no disrespect to another. Each of us is better equipped to show up as our full selves when we have a clear understanding of self-identity and where we come from. I've had the opportunity to travel internationally to listen to the experiences of Afrodescentes in Venezuela, in Cuba, El Salvador, and Mexico, as well as Germany. And I have also seen how manifestations of anti-Blackness like police harassment, radicalized exploitation, and social exclusion are a problem without borders. It is also time for my fellow Latinos to confront the racism, the shadeism, and the anti-Blackness that actually exists within our community. Not only do I welcome you to do that, I am doing it with you, and I will consistently show up to do that as well. I believe that once Black people are truly free, our world will be free of the many other manifestations of hate that deny people of their full humanity. And so I thank you, Bria. It's always a pleasure to be with you. But I also thank all of you for really listening to what Bria and myself have been saying, and how if we come together, we're able to really dismantle the systems of oppression that affect us every single day. So thank you again, Bria, for joining